From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. There are codified rights for children, employees at work, soldiers on the battlefield, animal welfare, even tree welfare. But what about our rivers? Stay with me. This week, so aggrieved at the state of the river test, a council in Hampshire decided to grant the river a sort of personhood, bestowing on it the right to flow unimpeded and without half the county's poo bobbing through it. Is this the way forward? The story today: human rights for rivers.
My name's Adam Vaughan. I'm the environment editor at The Times.
Do you have a favourite river, Adam?
I'm going to be partisan. I live down in Sussex, so I guess my favourite river, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't say my favourite river is the Ouse, which runs through Lewes, where I live, and which I don't often swim in, I must say, but there is a bit at Barkham Mills where I have been known to swim and paddleboard.
Why? Is the rest of it sort of oozing with other things?
There's some bits in town you probably wouldn't want to necessarily do that in, let's just say that.
And well, explain for us what is happening in Hampshire with the river test, because there's an interesting plan afoot. What are they doing?
In a way, nothing has happened. In a way, something momentous has happened. So councillors at Test Valley Borough Council, they've just voted unanimously to recognise the rights of rivers in the Test Valley. And probably the most famous river there is the Test, a chalk stream that, chalk streams were a sort of globally unique, important, precious habitat. They were featured in, David Attenborough's Wild Isles.
All wildlife is dependent to some extent on fresh water. But here in England, every single river is polluted. Runoff from farming and dumping of human waste causes algae to bloom. This reduces oxygen, chokes the plants and degrades the rivers on which our wildlife depends.
The thing they've done is they've basically agreed with this motion that was put forward to give rights to a river. So we're all familiar with the idea of human rights and people having rights. This, certainly in the UK, is a relatively new idea.
And this would mean what if I were a concerned citizen or resident nearby the test who wanted to kick up a fuss about how my river's been slowly ruined over the years?
The motion they've passed is that the river has the right to flow, it has the right to be free from pollution and contamination, and the right to feed and be fed by sustainable aquifers and other freshwater sources. So it's in a way, that's kind of what I meant by it. It's huge and it's nothing at the same time. To be clear, on a really practical, reductionist kind of level, this is no change because, this is all largely symbolic. Water regulation is primarily done at a national level in the UK, and in England in this case is where the relative laws would apply. But I think it's really just is indicative of the strength of feeling at a local level and how much people care about rivers. I think that in itself, although, doesn't necessarily carry weight in law, I think that does carry weight.
Because rivers up and down the land, we know, are having a difficult time at the moment. And in the test case, it's quite a popular fly fishing area, is that right? And even just the number of fish there has plummeted.
Yeah, so the Test is probably one of the most famous rivers in the south of England. As I mentioned, it's a chalk stream. It's got particularly clear waters, particularly lovely riverbeds at some points, some important plants there. Got trout, you've got other fish. It's famous for fly fishing. It's, I've been down there a couple of times. I'm not a fisher myself, but have been around, down to river summits and events there. And it is, it's a really beautiful place, some spots of it.
The Times editorial said that Jimmy Carter had even fly fished there. Unbelievable.
I know, I thought that was quite extraordinary. I mean, it's certainly, it's in a relatively wealthy part of the country as well, right? It's there's I think it's had its fair share of celebrity fishers.
This is not an idea unique to Hampshire, though, the idea of granting these kind of river rights. It's been done elsewhere.
That's correct. I mean, arguably the sort of modern kind of rights of nature movement, you could say it was born around sort of 2008 when the Ecuadorian constitution recognised such rights, and it was sort of cemented in 2017 when New Zealand gave a river legal personhood. So, there's a sort of international backstory here, and there's a US NGO as well, the Earth Law Centre, that's been pushing this idea too of rights for nature. So it's not unprecedented. This idea in terms of the UK is relatively new. It is still gaining a foothold. I mentioned I live down in Sussex. I mean, the district council there recently chose to recognise the rights of the Ouse there. So, it's getting there, but, and there's other efforts afoot around the UK, but it's still early doors in the UK.
Because what has been wrong with the current system of recourse, should we want to take issue with water companies polluting rivers?
I mean, I think the slightly glib answer to that is look at the state of our rivers, right? I mean, the often quoted figure is, 16% of waterways in England are in good ecological status. So that is jargon for near its natural state. The context for that percentage is that it's basically stayed the same for many years and is stubbornly unmoved. Again, the additional context for it is that we're trying to get to 75% by 2027, and that's clearly not going to happen. But I guess the reason people are pursuing these avenues of trying to give rivers personhood rights, however you want to describe it, is that people feel like the current avenues that they've tried via campaigning, via lobbying water companies, via the courts, judicial reviews of government and so on, I think there's just a sense that, that's not worked for them so far.
But it is a growing issue. We even saw that the last election, didn't we? And, even the Times having its Clean It Up campaign. It's in the ether. People are bothered politically even.
100%. So this really did sort of, I'm going to avoid too many water puns here, but it really did sort of swell up, in advance of the general election.
Beautiful.
And, there was polling showing more than half of people would factor it into how they voted. The Lib Dems saw such capital in it and the seats that they were targeting that they made it one of their top 3 issues, and just, had Ed Davey larking around in water. And
to the Liberal Democrats who are campaigning in the Lake District, and we have some pictures of their leader, Sir Ed Davey, paddleboarding earlier today with some initial success before then falling in with some embellishment perhaps there, either way.
I met him when he came down to Lewis, and he was sort of campaigning there at Eastbourne on the seafront and on the river and Ouse where I was. So they put a lot of capital into it, as did Labour, interestingly. And Labour sort of went for the whole sort of 14 years of Tory sewage scandal kind of attack line. And I guess the issue for Labour now is now their problem. They're now the ones who've got to do something about it. I suppose just a sort of an addendum to that is the reason all this has come up, or bubbled up, is that,
Stop it.
I'm sorry, I'll stop, I'll get my coat. The reason this has come up is because there are hundreds of groups of local people around the country who have self-organised and said enough is enough. And, there's ones like Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, who are one of the well-known ones to this acronym of WASP. There's Save Windermere up in Cumbria. There's SOS Whitstable down in Kent. These are the ones that everything else is built on the shoulders of these people.
And we must remember that things that happen to people's local areas are what animate them politically. I remember our colleague Patrick Maguire reporting in his book about the build-up to the last election that the Prime Minister's now Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, was very aware of, rubbish in the streets and people complaining about mattresses or white goods in front lawns in where they live. People sort of care about what's around them. You say it's now obviously their role to try and sort this out. What are the government actually pledging to do?
So the government's obviously been in power now for a year, and Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, made clear from the get-go that this is going to be one of his top priorities. The main thing they have done to date is to pass a law, the Water Special Measures Act, in February, and that brings in a few what I would call mini reforms. So, for example, it brings in the threat of jail sentences for bosses of water companies, but it's only for very specific offences about obstructing investigations. It's unlikely to ever get used. There's other stuff, which is arguably more material around banning bonuses of egregiously polluting companies. And that has happened for 6 water companies this year. So, these are chief executives having to forgo hundreds of thousands of pounds because of this new legal power. So there has been difference. The other thing to mention is in December, Ofwat, the water regulator, gave the green light for £104 billion of spending over the next 5 years, about 12 billion of which is earmarked for tackling sewage spills. So, Steve Reed is quite happily taking credit for that. I think, that was going to happen anyway. That was in train. That's merely just the sort of process working through.
Adam, we're discussing rivers and the problem with them across the UK. We were talking a moment ago about how it's a big political issue now, but for years and years and years, we've been culturally very wedded to our rivers, haven't we? From Wordsworth banging on about the ceaseless music of rivers to even recently, as you mentioned, David Attenborough getting quite misty-eyed about what's happening to chalk streams. Their damage kind of cuts a bit deeper, perhaps, than other things might.
Yeah, rivers are part of our culture, right? We're an island, rivers and seas, that's always been what the Times Clean-Up campaign's been about, both. You're an island nation, so you never let that far from the coast. And the rivers, as you mentioned, there's a cultural element. You think of some of the stories that still get referred to all the time, like Wind in the Willows. These are sort of part of a lot of people's childhoods. Obviously, not everyone gets the access to get out and see them, but, I can certainly remember going, looking for sticklebacks and things like that as a kid. And that comes back to the Attenborough thing of, if you don't know about something, you can't care about it, which has always been his argument for making sure kids get access to nature. I think also what's interesting, what I would observe is just, I think why you've got all these hundreds of local campaign groups have popped up is I cover a lot of environmental issues, and not all of them have the cut through outside of environmental bubbles. Sometimes they seem quite big, quite global, abstract. I can't do anything about it. I don't quite know how it affects my day-to-day life. Whereas these rivers and sea and coastlines, they're by nature place-based, right? It's one of the few environmental subjects I find tends to organically pop up in chats in the pub. There's not many that cut that, depending on your company. But it's something people, and it's also just really simple, right? People can see it. People can see the state of their rivers. I think there is also an element of changing attitudes. My sense is that during COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown restrictions, a lot of people had to rediscover their local area because it was all the only place they could go. And there was massive spike in sales of stand-up paddleboarding equipment. I think that was a point where a lot of people just rediscovered, I've got a beautiful waterway down, a mile down the road from me, and why am I never using that? Why am I not walking my dog by there, or why am I not trying to swim in it? So I think there is this element of people's expectations shifting in the last 5 years or so.
And there has been quite a sort of slow build-up to that. People like Robert Macfarlane, who I know recently have spoken to, people might have read some of his books, such as The Old Ways, or actually he's got a new one, Is a River Alive, that's just come out. But what does he think about all of this?
So I had a good chat with Robert, who's, as you said, a wonderful nature writer, and his new book, Is a River Alive? It's primarily a sort of travel log where he goes off to Ecuador, India and Canada and looks at rivers there. He finds the hope in these sort of local efforts.
We have, and I suppose at the moment it's really a community-led reimagining of relations with rivers, of which the rights idea is one part. The phrase I use for this is the geography of hope. So if we think of hope residing in places as well as in hearts, places we can go to where we see rivers being imagined otherwise, rivers living other lives, not dying. So in Ecuador, where the rights for nature were inaugurated into the constitution in 2008 during its revision, so real power to the judgment, absolutely leveraging the idea that rivers and forests have rights.
He's among a group of people who read aloud the rights of the River Cam every Midsummer's Day. He's following these initiatives afoot in the Don in Sheffield and the Clyde in Glasgow to get rights for rivers there. That's where he sees the hope, and I think he, to my point of in a way, this doesn't mean anything that the council has recognised the rights of the River Test and surrounding rivers. I said to him, why does this matter? There's no greater protection now than before with rights. And he said, well, in a sense, it's a dream, but it's also a very powerful dream, which is beginning to become part of the bigger movement of river recovery.
It's a dream, but it's also a very powerful dream, which is beginning to become part of the bigger movement of river recovery. I love that idea that rivers can be healed and can heal themselves, and when they heal themselves, they heal us with them. I absolutely believe that, and it's part of our relationship with water, which is that it is a life force and not a resource that has been progressively monetized and instrumentalized out of sight into invisibility.
He called it a crisis of imagination as well as legislation.
I genuinely feel very hopeful.
Really?
I think, the crisis is so visible and so present, and is going to take so long to sort. But it is a crisis of imagination as well as legislation.
So I guess it speaks to the fact that this sort of stuff will lead to public pressure, will lead to new laws, etc.
Now, I'm sure you'd rather drown yourself in a river than be the Environment Secretary in charge of them. But if you were to be forced, what would you do? Is it clear?
God, what would I do? I think, without making it too simple, I would say it is just largely about money, primarily. And, a lot of people listening to this will be unhappy about the water bill that they've got from their company this year. Mine has certainly gone up. I'm in the Southern Waters patch, which has put up water bills more than any other company in England and Wales. And I suppose I would just plead with people to understand why those bills are going up, and that if we want the sort of clean rivers and seas that we all do, then we're going to have to pay for it. And the kicker to that is obviously you've got to look after the most vulnerable in society, and not everyone always has the means. So, there needs to be social tariffs and so on. And I guess my point on the money is also referring to how we regulate this industry, because in England and to an extent Wales, we have this unusual experiment, which we've had since Thatcher privatised the industry in 1989, of a privatised water industry, which is an anomaly in the rest of Europe, right? That's a long-winded way of saying these are a bunch of regulated monopolies. If you're going to have monopolies, you need to have regulators with the resource to check they're doing what they're saying they're doing. And that, when we've seen huge cuts in the last decade or so to the budget of, say, the Environment Agency, which is there to enforce the law.
The government recently announced some changes in terms of how our waterways are going to be regulated. What have they decided to do?
So the government last year ordered a massive review of water regulation led by a guy called Sir John Cunliffe, billed as the biggest shake-up of how we look at water for 36 years. And very recently he gave his 400-odd page report, and he had 88 recommendations in there. And so far the government, led by Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, have accepted 5 of those, and they are now going away over summer to see how many of the rest they'll accept by autumn. The sort of key one, which is a kind of new super regulator, which is the idea of taking 4 former regulators and piling them into one, including the abolishing Ofwat. So that's clearly going to take a long time. But there's a whole bunch of other recommendations as well, including like these sort of regional water boards, kind of powers to block material changes of ownership of water companies. The list goes on. It was billed as a reset, and I think if the government follows through with like most of these recommendations, then that is what this will be. It will be a really sort of seismic change for the sector.
And we've talked almost ad nauseum on this podcast in particular about the problems of the water companies. But is it entirely their fault? Or is it, at the risk of the wrath of emails, farmers and other people who come into contact with the rivers?
I'm glad you asked that question, Luke, because it's a real hobby horse of mine. So if you look purely on numerical terms, farmers actually come out as the top source of pollution, ever so slightly above of water. They're basically on a par, but farmers are strictly speaking top. And then it's water companies, and then it is roads, so runoff from highways and so on. And I guess the reason it doesn't get so much attention is it's complicated. There's more than 100,000 farms in England. And, there's 9 major water companies in England. So it's much easier to focus on just 9 companies, right?
There's no sort of farming fat cats to bash.
Do you know what I mean? Let's be clear, there are some farmers doing quite well, despite most or many of the ones I speak to at least, struggling. But I think, it's not like necessarily talking about a sector that's awash with money. And that's when you get to issues of government support and subsidy schemes so they can do boring but important things like manage slurry better, look at how they manage the edge of their fields so that soil isn't washing off into rivers. And I guess ultimately as well, and people might not want to talk about this, but ultimately it also comes back down to the rest of us who are buying farmers' products. It comes back down to diet change and what we eat. It's not a particularly comfortable subject for many people, but if you think of, for example, the River Wye, the problems we know there are clearly linked to the amount of chicken manure that ends up getting spread on fields and washing into the rivers. So, would that happen if we were all vegans? I don't know, but it's a discussion we should be having.
It all comes back to veganism all the time, doesn't it?
I'm now the one who's going to get the nasty emails.
But it was interesting what you said there about the chicken poo being spread on fields, as I imagine as some kind of fertiliser. Is there anything new or particularly egregious that farmers have been doing of late which is contributing to this problem? Or is it just the fact that farming is getting more intensive and the kind of ordinary things that farmers do when intensified aren't good for the rivers that they're near?
It's the latter. So when I first started out reporting on the Times' Clean Up campaign, 2 odd years ago, I spent a long time talking to academics and I asked exactly the same question you've done. And the answer is intensification. So, we've had decades of pressure on farmers to intensify to get as much yield, as much food as they can out of that finite land. And this is the cost of that. An obvious way to increase yield is by, nitrogen fertilizer, right? And then that nitrogen has to go somewhere. And often, if it's not well managed, it ends up going into the river. It also goes into the atmosphere, but that's a whole other story.
We should say that not all of our rivers are teeming with chicken poo. Some of them are still quite pleasant. So as an end point, I don't know, what's your best river memory? Maybe when sort of Adam was young, playing in a river somewhere.
My memories of water are mainly of like swimming off Brighton seafront is my childhood memories. That's my most fond memory of. And I suppose this does speak to your question about rivers, I'm completely ducking the question here. Yeah, but right. I think the thing I love about water and the sea and rivers is it brings people together. And that was the thing that I used to love about the beach. It brought all my family, all the different generations together.
And actually, it wasn't too long ago again on this podcast that we did a thing about Thames Water in particular. And I went swimming with this group who go swimming at least a couple of times a week near Teddington Lock on the Thames.
Over 10 is warm, over 10 is fine. But it goes down to 5 and 3.
I don't need a wetsuit or anything.
No. But
I'm a fragile soul.
And that was, having arrived feeling quite sniffy about the whole thing and peeved about how cold it was looking, it was really pleasant. They brought a drinks trolley, everyone contributed biscuits or cakes or bottles of things, and just the socialising around it. If I lived anywhere near Teddington, I think good grief I'd be there every week. Apart from the poo in the water, which they did have to test for before they went in to make sure it was okay.
Yeah, that's the thing. The growth in wild swimming in this country has been huge. It used to be the sort of thing that was the preserve of nature writers, and now it's where people have got the access, they take it, right? And it's not just all the sort of million articles that us and others have published about the health benefits of cold water swimming, but my sense is it's bringing people together. That's why it's important to people.
Adam, pleasure as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke.
Times Environment Editor Adam Vaughan. Plenty more from him and the Times' Clean Up campaign over at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. We'll also put a link in the description of this episode to the Times editorial view on all of this as well. If you've got any views, river-based or otherwise, the story at thetimes.com is how to get in touch with us. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Edward Drummond, executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.